and that not all sacrifice is of life itself, but there is that part that is suffering and the loss of friends. As General Pershing, the commander of the AEF, American Expeditionary Force, said at the dedication of the National World War I Memorial, quote, "They suffered as only those who have been through that war can realize. The highest praise that can be bestowed upon them is to hope that America will continue to raise such sons," unquote. 3. This is the story of a common man being in the right place and sometimes the wrong place at the right time and being thrust into uncommon experience. Slide. Rube, as we called him, was born in 1893 and was 24 years old in 1917 when the war broke out for him. He was a cowboy by initial occupation as a young boy growing up on the McGarry Ranch in Solano County, California. It was a large horse and cattle ranch that supplied horses to the livery stables of San Francisco. His father was the ranch foreman. He grew up learning how to train horses, raise cattle, how to hunt and fish, and supplement the family table. Slide. Here's Rube, horseback in France. And if you look at the white horse, he is immediately to the left. And he was very small. He's only like 5'5". And I think he's on a big horse, so he almost looks as tall as the other people, but that's him. His youth on the ranch and skill with horses got him assigned to the mounted orderly group of the 39th Infantry Regiment, Colonel Bowles commanding. Bowles was a charger, and he had been awarded the Distinguished Service Charge for action in the Philippines in 1899. So he knew how to command in combat, and he was trusted with 4,000 men. I grew up listening to the stories of his great adventures, first on the fields of the ranch and the mountains above it, next in the battlefields of France, and of his march into Germany after the armistice. He had never left the west coast of the United States before that time. The beginning of his journey took him from Northern California to Washington State for training, which is the photograph that you'll see in a moment. Or actually, we just saw that photograph. And then by rail across the country to the East Coast for more training, and then to embarkation at Hoboken, New Jersey, aboard the Leviathan, which was a captured German luxury liner on which he would sail to Calais, France. His pilot, his Navy pilot, on that journey was Humphrey Bogart, who helped steer the ship safely past the German U-boats. So, my journey, well, I want to thank my wife, Margaret, because she's the one who encouraged me to take the journey, and that was to do the research, to come up with a plan on how to visit the main battle sites where he was, and to really dive deep as I could in the amount of time that I had into his major engagements in eastern France. So I contacted the current commander of the 39th Infantry, which is now that training unit. CEO was kind enough to give me that letter of recommendation, which you had when you showed up, and I had that translated into French professionally. Lieutenant Colonel Stagel regrets being unable to attend. I had an email with him today. He wished he could be here, but he can't. My journey finished up in Paris at the Arc de Triomphe, dancing with Margaret in the underground clubs to jazz the night before the centenary celebration. That was fun, and we Ubered back. And the next day, standing next to the Arc on November 11th, 2018, as Presidents Macron and Trump and many others commemorated the armistice exactly 100 years to the hour later. Slide 6. So the general in charge of making sure that America prevailed was General Pershing. That's him standing there with the black belt. And to say that he was a hard charger and a master strategist would be an understatement. But he was also possessed of an extraordinary emotional intelligence. One of the first official visits he paid in France was to the grave of the Marquis de Lafayette, the great French tactician who was instrumental in helping the nascent American army defeat the British in the Revolution. Pershing spoke briefly and then turned to his aide, designated orator Colonel Stanton, who stood at the grave of Lafayette and said, "What we have of blood and treasure is yours. In the presence of the illustrious dead, we pledge our hearts and our honor to carrying this war to a successful conclusion." And then the final line of his speech, Lafayette, we are here.
Bravo. Wow. That's awesome.
Slide.
That's awesome.
Now, the two nations had shed blood together, and the French were rejuvenated. Slide. This is the route of the battles that I took, just a Google Maps screenshot that shows, you'll see in the upper left, well, you see Paris in the lower left, then Norroy up top, and then there's a travel down to Saint-Blanc, I guess I pronounce it, and then up to the Meuse-Argonne and the infamous battle at Bois de Ferret. So why don't we roll Farmer's Field, next slide. Okay, we'll just skip through this. This is on the American monument at Chateau Thierry. You can skip that. This is the actual place that the 39th was inserted. The number 4 that I've circled there is the 4th Division, and the 39th was there on the Ourcq River. Slide. Okay, this is a brief video that I took standing outside the site of his first battle, which was Norroy.
I am now on the southeastern edge of the Bois de Cresse, where the battle took place. This eastern edge is the area where the 39th consolidated, regrouped, having taken the wood from the Germans. I just spoke with a farmer here working this land, and he says that he still plows up shells 100 years later. Wow. So I know I'm in the exact spot. I went over the map with him, and I'm in the exact spot where the battle took place. And now I'm going to head to the village that was liberated, Norroy-sur-Ourcq.
Thank you, Tyler. And just so that you know, we had to try to jury rig this because all my videos were gone. I broke my phone and they were gone, and the only videos left are on Facebook. So we had to go back and forth, but he's doing a great job. So this is just a scene going into Norroy. It was beautiful when I was there. Slide. Going into Norroy-sur-Ourcq. Slide. And you'll see in the upper left, the green area that's sort of square, almost rectangular, that's the wood. And I was standing sort of at where on that wood it would be sort of like 3 o'clock. Slide. These are everywhere in France, as I'm sure some of us know. These are the monuments the French put up to the children who were killed in that village as a result of the bombardments or disease or whatever happened to take them down. Slide. This is a cross outside of New York, a memorial to the battle. Slide. And this photo just came to me yesterday from my new friend in France. He was on a big, long bike ride, and he knew that I had been to Norroy. And so he wanted to take a shot just outside of the village, and you can see the wheat fields standing tall. This was taken, I think, 3 or 4 days ago. Slide. This is just a commendation from a famous French general to the 7th American Brigade. So the brigade was made up of 2 regiments, the 39th, and I'm trying to remember the number of the other one. Anyway, slide. Another letter of commendation. Slide. This is the massive American memorial overlooking Chateau Thierry and the Marne River. And it's very impressive if you ever get a chance to go to the little town. It's a beautiful little town. You should check it out. Slide. On the upper right is on the left-hand side of this, the famous Marine battle at Belleau Wood. And then to the right, slide, Norroy-sur-Ourcq. Slide. So one thing led to another, and I wanted to go up north to the next battle, but I didn't know how to get there, and the map that I had wasn't very good, so I turned on maps, and this just gives you an idea of sort of the area where I was. So Paris on the very left, you'll see Chateau Thierry below the red dot, and then just to the north of that, Ferme des Trois Earls. So The next stop on the tour was Saint-Thibault, which was far in the north, but I never made it up there because I decided to seek out this farm en route to Saint-Thibault, where my grandfather had camped. So he had been encamped at this Ferme de Trois Earl, and the reason I knew this is because that book over there on the table references it. It's just a very small one sentence that said they camped at Ferme de Trois Earl. So I said, what the heck? So I turned on Google Maps, and voila, there it was, as its own destination. It is such an old farm and landmark that it shows up on Google Maps just by searching the name of the farm. And it's a big farm in the outskirts of the village Bouvard. I drove down a long lane to the farm and was greeted at the end of the lane by 3 dogs. So I don't dislike dogs, but I'm not a great dog person. So I just stayed in the car because I was a little scared. They were barking, they were jumping on the hood of the car. They didn't jump on it, but they put their paws up on it. So I was a little scared, so I waited. And then a man got out of one of the cars next to me, which kind of startled me. He must have just either was leaving or was going. I'm not quite sure. And then he knocked on my window. So I rolled the window down. The dog was right there. The dog practically jumped in the car. And I introduced myself as best as I could. Je suis désolé de ne pas parler français. And I handed him my letter of introduction in French. He read it, took him a minute, and he smiled at me. And he said, "You're American." I thought it was very obvious. I said, "Yes." And he said, "Come, don't worry about the dogs." Very good English. So I knew, oh boy, this is, I don't know what's gonna happen, but this might be kind of fun. We went inside the farmhouse. There's the farmhouse, and there's one of the dogs who was very nice to me after he knew I wasn't gonna do anything bad. Next slide. There's the farmhouse. So it seems that I had arrived on a Sunday, just before the midday meal. And I'm always ready for a meal, so this was perfect for me. And I thought about it, but I didn't say anything, but I thought about it. Now, Sylvain introduced me all around. Present were his grandmother, she was 96, his father, mother, 2 sons. Sylvain had spent some time on the East Coast. His English was very good as we proceeded. He invited me to sit and drink champagne with him. I said, fine. Champagne was poured all around with homemade pâté en croûte. And everybody was gathered around the fire. They had a roaring fire, and in this fire, it was about this size. This was in their, living room. I said to myself, oh my God, I have to say something. So I rose, and I thought about it for just a second, and I waited, but I thought it was a good time. I rose, and I said, to France and America, may we always be allies. And they smiled. And the grandmother, I found out later, had been an English teacher for years in the village, so she understood everything I was saying, but she was pretending she understood nothing. Okay. So then Sylvain's wife, Florence, she came in, and she had been at De Gaulle picking up their daughter who was on some trip or whatever. So let's just go through these slides really quickly. So here's Papa with his favorite wine. Next slide. There it is. So stiff. I thought that was wonderful. Here's the cheese. I love that. Oh, that was the best. And the homemade apple tart. This was the capstone to the meal right here. I love that. This is inside, and you can see what a dining room. The hand-carved beams, the mounted animals. It was great. All the furniture was wonderful. Slide. Yep. Slide. There's, back one, sorry. I don't know if you can. Oh, yeah. Well, that was my grandmother. Don't worry about it. But that was my new grandmother. There she is. So she's 96, and she's just fantastic. And it was her father that must have said to Colonel Bowles, "You may stay here. You may stay here." So think about it. Bowles shows up. He's got 4,000 men. Have them camp out on the farm. And he may or may not have stayed in either the barn or the house. We don't know if they invited him in the house or not. If they had invited him in the house, then it's quite possible that my grandfather was also in the house because he was a mounted orderly. And he was running messages for the colonel back and forth, putting himself at extreme danger running back and forth. He eventually got shelled and got blown off his horse and ended up in a field hospital on one of the battles. But So that's it. Slide. So that shows where the farm is. Slide. And here's the family.
Aw.
So Sylvain, obviously on the right, I date him at about 48 years old. Maybe he was older because he eats very well. And then the farmhouse is in the back. Slide. And this is one of the largest oak trees in France. It's on the oak tree tour circuit. And that's me, you can see. Okay, next. Now, this was really fun. Okay. So we had a lovely lunch, blah, 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 did all that. And then Sylvain said it was time for a walk. I said, okay. I mean, I was full of Bordeaux and cheese and tart. I didn't know if I was going to be able to get up. He said it was time for a walk, and he said the walk might turn into a hunt. And I thought, oh, wow, this is going to be great, because I love, go hunting. Even if I'm not hunting, I love to be on the walk for the hunt, right? So the first stop, though, was the barn. So, slide. This is the interior of the barn, and Sylvain said, I want to show you something. So he got a big ladder, and he propped it up against that stone column. And then he got a spotlight, and he told me, climb. Slide. Slide. So I climbed. It's kind of hard to see. Maybe go to the next slide. Thank you, Tyler. John Welch, Madison, Wisconsin, USA, August 17th, 1918.
Wow.
So these are the men of the 39th. They were in the barn. Maybe they were injured. I'm not sure. But they couldn't have been that badly injured if they climbed that ladder like I did. So, after the barn, slide. Oh, before we do that, the Italians always get in there somewhere, right? So the Italians came in the barn, I don't know when, it doesn't even have a date. He especially wanted to, maybe it does have a date, he wanted to point this out to me. It says, victory or death. In Italian, okay. All right, slide. Okay, so I guess we can run this first video at the top. Thank you. Thanks, Tyler.
Share one moment with the dog and look at the lecture.
Yes. It's a beautiful day.
So the dogs were everywhere, and it was obvious they had only one purpose, and that was to make Sylvain very, very happy. So let's go, let's see if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so the next slide is just, oh, no, back one. Yeah, the one there below, the second one down. I don't know if you can get to that one. Yeah, the video, I'm so sorry, the video.
Here on the Ferme à Trois, and this is where my grandfather camped prior to the Battle of Saint-Thibault. And we look across the fields and then back to the farm where I was just graciously hosted with some lovely Bordeaux.
All right, so that's that, and then there's one more short slide on the, or no, short video rather, on the next slide. Sorry, Tyler.
Here comes Sylvain with the pheasant. Yes, wonderful. I love pheasant. Wonderful.
All right, so that's that. So, and that was one shot by Sylvain, and that pheasant was moving. It was moving left to right really fast, and he just swung and dropped it, boom. We tried to flush some pigs out of the wood, but we couldn't get it. Dogs couldn't find any, so we gave up on that. And then he wanted me to come home with him to the farm and have dinner. And of course, I was still full, but what do you say? I said, absolutely, yes. So, and I enjoyed that very much, and I laid off the Bordeaux for that one because I knew I had to leave. So at the end of the dinner, he invited me to stay overnight. I said, no, I can't, because I have to get back to the computer and do all this stuff, all this work. Maybe another night, and we agreed I would be back. Slide. And there is Papa and me with the pheasant. It was fun. It was quite an impromptu deal, but it was fun. Slide. Thank you, Tyler. So now, I was going to head north, so I'm leaving off the drive from Chateau Thierry on the lower left, but this is the direction you would go from Ferme à Trois up north to the scene of the next battle. the battle for Saint-Thibault and the strong points on the Vel River. So this was a big situation because this was a counterattack that the French had designed, and they had designed this to really try to stop the Germans right where they were, so they could not advance towards Paris. And of course, the French know the ground; they know exactly where to concentrate forces and everything else. And the American army was there as an adjunct, but their placement was critical. They had to be in the right place at the right time, and if they screwed it up, it was going to be hell to pay. So let's see. Slide. Okay, we'll just leave it right there for now. So after about 20 minutes of driving north from the farm, I went down into the Vel River Valley, and no buildings were visible till I entered the village, small village, even by Champagne region standards. And then I took a photograph of the largest house after the church, and that was it. And as soon as I did that, a man opened the door in the house, and he motioned me forward like this. And I'm sure he wanted to know, well, what the heck was I doing there? Because this is a very small village, and it's way out there, and I don't think it's seen an American tourist in a long, long time. So I handed him my letter of introduction. Thank God I had that. He read it. He invited me in for coffee. Game on. I had happened upon the mayor, one Jean Lebray. Slide. He showed me a note he had received from Ambassador Rogers. He had hosted a delegation in 1987 to celebrate the rebuilding, I guess, of the bridge. Well, the bridge had been destroyed by the Germans in 2 wars, and had been rebuilt, and it fell down. They had to build it again. Anyway, it was a deal enough to get the ambassador there. So, slide. We'll just leave it there. So John spoke little English, and we're trying to communicate, and then the phone rings, and I have been delivered. Because on the line is his son Pierre, who lives in Luxembourg. And Pierre speaks perfect English, thank God. So we talked, and then we talked for a few minutes, and he really wanted to know what the heck I was doing in this little village. And I asked him, I said, well, I'm here, doing research for World War I commemoration, my grandfather, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, I said, you mean to tell me nobody's ever been here before doing this? And he said, no, not to my knowledge. My dad never talked about it. And so anyway, it looks like I was one of the first anyway. So we went over a lot of old photographs, but the language barrier was pretty substantial. So I said, look, coming out, can we walk around the town? He got it. We started walking around the town. That only took like 3 minutes. And then I said, I really want to see the bridge, because the bridge was the point of contention. Anyone, knows this, right? So I wanted to see the bridge, and he said, no bridge, you can't go to the bridge, because the road was blocked off to the bridge because they were rebuilding the bridge. So he said, but I take you. I said, okay, take me where? He said, I take you. So here we go. We go out to the barn, and in the barn, there's this tarp, and beneath the tarp is this old Renault, like a micro car. It's like a 2-seater. And he motions me to get in, and the latch is broken on the outside, so I have to reach in, and I open it from the inside, and I pull it open, and then on the seat, I expected to sit down, but they're like agricultural magazines stacked up on the... So I had to put everything sort of on the floor, and then he fired it up, and then we ripped out of his barn, literally like one of those scenes, I don't know, we ripped out of the barn, and we went down the lane, around the outskirts of town, and then all of a sudden, there was no turn signal, there was no warning, nothing. He just turned and left the road. So now we're on this, anyway, I guess roll the video. That's the best way to show this one.
Jean drives like a tank commander.
I hope you could say that, because what I said was John drives a little Renault like a tank commander. So I guess roll the next one if you would, Tyler, the next video.
On voit,
Thank you.
il y a trop de soleil, on ne voit pas le village. On est oui. Oui, oui.
I don't know what he meant, but it sounded good.
We're about this place.
side.
Les grues.
Yes. Merci.
Okay, so I just said yes to something he said in French, which I didn't know what it was. And now he starts talking to me, and he does know enough English to get it across to me, and he's very emphatic, and he says, we have to go somewhere muy importante. Well, that's Spanish, but. So we drove south. Now we're driving south, and we are hauling ass, pardon me, in this little Renault to the hills overlooking the river valley. Back the direction I had come from heading into Santabo, and I'm thinking, what are we going to do now? And then we turned east down this really rocky road, and we worked our way up onto the hillside. John parked the car, and then we dove into the forest. Slide. That one. Thank you.
Jean is taking me to the heights above the town to show me where the fighting holes are.
And I'm going to get melodramatic, so I'm sorry.
Des tranchées
Oh,
individuelles.
the trench.
Trench, mais, avec le temps, with time,
With time, it is slowly closed.
Hold up.
We'll wait. Anyway, what he says is, with time, it is slowly closed up. What I said was, it is slowly closed up like a dent in dough. And then, it might run or it might not. Anyway, the next thing he shows me is this huge shell crater filled with branches and everything. And you can't see in the video, so it's almost not as good as it didn't run. But you're in this shell crater, and it's huge, and it's 5 feet deep below grade after 100 years of erosion and everything else. So it was very, very clear, and he showed me the fighting holes, he showed me the trench line as it was outlined in there, and it was quite impressive. So, slide. Let's see, we have to go one, yeah, this is it, okay. So, on the way back to the village, he just offhandedly said, that was the Roman road. And I said, what? Roman road. He said, the road that ran from Germany to France. So the men of the 39th had dug themselves into a hillside not 20 yards from where Roman legions had traversed. But no Pax Romana here. A terrific battle was fought here. And the German army was quite capable and willing to defend the Velle River. Indeed, they were told to defend it at almost any cost. And cost was borne by both sides. Slide, video. That was the American cemetery right nearby. And had Rube perished in the battle for Saint-Thibault, 39th took about 40% casualties with very poor medical care. He would have been buried here at the cemetery, somewhere among the 6,000 that fell in 3 days. America did indeed give her sons. And in that time, most of the enlisted were poor, many of them immigrants. Their families in the United States did not have a lot of resources. And when they were notified of the deaths, they had two choices. They could either pay to repatriate their remains, or they could have them buried in these American cemeteries on French soil. The first cross that you see there closest to you, all it says is, here rests in honor, glory, an American soldier known but to God. Slide.
That's where your grandfather is? Somewhere in there? No.
No. No, thank God. Now, this was fun. Okay, time had come to have a little bit of fun. So Margaret was flying in to join me. She couldn't join me for the whole trip. She joined me here. So I drove back to Charles de Gaulle. I picked her up, and I wanted to give her a surprise. So I didn't tell her where she was going. She thought she was going to an Airbnb somewhere in the countryside of France. So what she didn't know, and I didn't tell her because it was fun to keep it a secret, was Sylvain and Florence had invited us to stay at their farm overnight rather than driving all the way back out east to Verdun, which is the last stop on the tour. So I picked her up, we drove east. She asked me if we were staying with a family that would cook for us. I said yes. She didn't have to worry about that. She seemed satisfied. She got it back on her laptop and that was that. And what I didn't tell her is that we were gonna have supper and stay the night at Sylvain and Florence's house. Slide. They had prepared a lovely meal, and we were permitted to go into the cellar and pick the wine. So I went straight for the Bordeaux that I knew would be good based on the names. I don't know much, but I know that much. Picked the names, and so we did that. It was fantastic. Slide. That was a nice one. I don't know. Patrick, was that a good one?
Yeah.
He likes it. He's French and he likes it, so next. And this is just inside to show you the outline again. Proof that Margaret was there, she was. Slide. And you know, to me, the whole thing with that was, it wasn't the meal, it wasn't the wine, it was that feeling of connection and camaraderie in a way, that fraternity that I got out of it. They were literally hosting another member of the Freitas family almost exactly 100 years later. It's wonderful. So we're gonna skip that, let's see. Yeah, so now we'll stop right there for the moment. So the last battle was the Meuse-Argonne, which was the big push basically to get the Germans to say basta, to say enough. So, I don't know what it is in German. But, so the Meuse-Argonne offensive, super important, and the 39th drew the short straw. The 39th drew a very short straw because they had to attack from the sector of Verdun that the French called the Hill of the Dead Men. And Patrick, would you be so kind to say that in French for me? Because I love it when they said it when I was there in Verdun.
La colline de la mort.
Fantastic, I can't say it like that. So anyway, let's roll the first video.
From Hill 304, fighting their way through the German defenses, 39th Infantry would have crossed this ground and headed into those woods, right there.
And then the next one, if you would, please.
Farm road that is just east of the village of Cuisy, and the hill, the big hill that you see in the distance, is Hill 304 above Verdun. So the 39th Infantry would have crossed, according to the history, would have crossed these fields
I had my
and
map.
moved into position. And as it describes in the history, the 3rd Battalion, quote, the 3rd Battalion filtered into Cuisy and took more than 600 prisoners after a brief fight. So there's the village of Cuisy, and we're going to go down in there now.
The regimental history also describes that fighting in the village was hand to hand with the bayonet, and then one of the German officers said, basta.
And ran up to not to.
Go ahead, thank
After
you.
leaving Sepsarges, they crossed the open ground and ran up to Nantua to the road leading from east to west. I'm heading there now.
And we'll stop right there for the moment. So Verdun was huge, and the French know this very, very well because they endured it. One of the most famous battles ever. It lasted from February 16 to December 16, caused over 700,000 dead. Verdun was a strategic place, and throughout French history, and it had to be defended. It had to be defended almost to the last man as far as the French were concerned, and their army was extraordinary. They held the Germans off here at Verdun, and it basically became a stalemate. And when an American soldier landed on the dock in France, the CO would give him a little medal that, and I have this medal, I don't have it here with me tonight, but it basically was a medal from the French government. It was a little medallion, it was maybe the size of a dime, and on it, it said in French, "They shall not pass."
Ils ne passeront pas.
That's what it says in French. So they were very, very determined. Thank you, Patrick. They were very determined that it wasn't going to happen. So by 1917, the French had succeeded in pushing the Germans back a little bit, but at great cost. And now the cost to drive the Germans further north, past Hill 304 and up to the north, would be borne by the United States. 7th Brigade, of which the 39th Infantry was a part, had been ordered to capture those villages I told you, showed you. Cuisine and Sepsars was lay on the plain to the north of Hill 304, southwest of the Meuse River. So, at a certain point, this was the most complicated part of the trip because there was a lot going on, there's a lot in the history, and I had to interpret old battle maps and then basically do a layover on Google Maps to know where we were going. And Margaret was with me, and she knows that I would stop and I would just examine something and figure out, well, this must be the road. And they said they were 3 clicks from here, which means we're about in the right spot. So at one point, the Germans counterattacked, and it was a big counterattack. And the 39th was stalled. There's a hill 295 there, and they dug in for the night. And the situation was so grave for the 39th that Colonel Bowles, the regimental commander, decided that he must move directly up on the front, actually up at the fire teams, and design the next tactical action, because he had lieutenants dead, he had captains dead, and he had sergeants leading, and they were doing a good job, but the threat of a reversal became really pronounced. So even Brigadier General Poor, in charge of the 7th Brigade, took a position on the front line as well. So now you have generals on the front, leading from the front. The next morning, September 28th, the 39th reassembled, went over again, and pushed the Germans back decisively, causing them to regroup in the Bois de Fay. Both Bowles and Poor would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for their actions that day. Go ahead and roll this video.
Standing here next to this 4th Division monument was probably put up in the early 1920s when members of the 4th Division returned to view their battlefields. And
oh, darn. Yeah, if you could. I'd like to run this one if it will reload. Maybe we'll give it a bit of time and I'll talk. So the Bois de Fay, what I was describing is it was really a complicated situation because they were being shelled from across the river. They couldn't get across the river. The Germans were on the other side of the Meuse River, and they were shelling them. And incoming shells into the Bois de Fay at their position were about 20 a minute. So it says right here in the history, German shells dropped at the rate of 20 per minute on the southern edge of the Bois de Fay.
standing here next to this 4th Division monument was probably put up in the early 1920s when members of the 4th Division returned to view their battlefields. And beyond the monument was the Bois de Fay, where there was where the 39th Infantry drove the Germans out of the wood, destroyed their positions, and basically took the area on the heights above the town of Grelles-sur-Meuse. So the Meuse River is just on the other side of town, and while they were in the Bois de Fay, they were being shelled incessantly by German 77s from across from the other side of the river. And it was here, in the Bois de Fay, that Colonel Bowles was wounded
and had to be evacuated. And so they sent up another colonel to take over command. They had one in reserve, and he moved up on horseback and took over. So this battle at Bois de Fay, and Bolswood are in the DSC there, this battle of Bois de Fay was a harbinger of what was to come at Bois de Malemont and Bois de Foray. Per the history, the trails in the Bois de Malemont were entirely blocked by fallen trees, and the underbrush, wired together with barbed wire, was so dense as to make forward movement practically impossible. Captain Norton, who commanded the 1st Battalion, had his pipe shot out of his mouth by a German sniper. So they were doing their stuff. And during that night, plans were made for a general attack across the entire Western Front. So the French general, Foch, how would we pronounce that? Foch. He was the supreme commander, and General Pershing technically reported to him, but had veto power on where German troops, or where American troops would go. He designed it, they executed it, and it ultimately led to the Germans signing the armistice. So the Bois de Foray, we need to roll the next video, which is Bois de Foray. This one isn't quite as long.
I am on the edge of the Bois de Foray, which was my grandfather's last battle in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And I'm going to read just a little brief excerpt from the regimental history here. Quote, at 28 minutes past 7 on the morning of October 11th, following closely behind a well-placed barrage, 2nd Battalion moved forward and in spite of the terrific machine gun fire and heavy casualties, advanced steadily. 2 minutes later, the entire front line rushed with a yell that could be heard above the din of battle, taking the German position in the Bois de Foray with the bayonet. The fighting was fierce, but lasted only a few seconds, unquote. So this was his last battle. He often told me stories about the Bois de Foray, how tough it was in here. And shortly after this battle, they were put back into reserve.
So the Bois de Foray was the end of the action for the 39th. They were out. They were depleted. Many of their officers were dead. They had huge problems. They had supply problems, but they had even bigger problems. And that was a leadership problem. And they needed replacements even at the junior NCO level. So they were relieved in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army in any war. And on October 18th, they were relieved. At one point, there were 1 million men on the line for the Meuse-Argonne campaign, which people don't really realize. It's something about World War I people don't realize was the scope and the scale. And one thing, I don't want to make this a big history lesson on World War I, but there's this perception that it was trench warfare, and for many, many years it was. But when the Americans showed up, Pershing's design was always war of movement. It was the beginnings of American combined arm action movement warfare. It was in its infancy, but they had tanks, they had airplanes, there were French airplanes, but they had airplanes and they were taught by the French how to fly them. It was a big deal. So they were out, and on November 10th, 1918, they completed their move to Houdecourt-sur-le-Coast, southeast of Verdun, to prepare for the next big offensive, because it wasn't over yet. The Germans had already tried to get an armistice, and it was refused. So we didn't feel that we had them exactly where we wanted them. The rail line at Sedan needed to be cut, and that was the next threat. But until they could do that, that was that. So on November 10th, 2018, exactly 100 years to the day, on his final eve of war, Margaret and I drove to the area of the last battle at Houdecourt-sur-le-Coast in 1 hour and 17 minutes from the battlefield at Bois de Foray. It took his regiment 10 days to cover that same ground through the muddy roads, choked with wagon teams and trucks, if they could make it, through the mud, moving supplies up to the front, and the wounded moving to the rear. And then we pulled into this little town, And I don't have a prayer. I didn't have a prayer then, and I won't have a prayer now of pronouncing this. But I'm going to let Patrick do it since he's so good at this. I'm sorry it's not up on the screen, but it's right here.
Vignoles, les Hatton-Châtel.
Now you can see why I couldn't do it. He sure could. Okay, go ahead and roll the video. Thank you, Pat.
The name I literally cannot pronounce, but there's American flags everywhere. French flags, American flags. It's November 10th, first day of the Marine Corps, and we were about 7 miles from where my grandfather was on this date, one day prior to the armistice being signed. So we're going to head on up the road and go to Doughboy.
So we entered Houdecourt-sur-le-Caux, and everywhere I saw the American flag standing next to a French flag. It was uniform, as if the mayor had decreed that it be so. That was it. And my intent in being in this town, because it was a long drive to get down there, it was 1 hour and 17 minutes, which doesn't seem like much, but anyway, it was a long drive to get down there, but my intent was to find this wood, the Bois de la Belle Osier, I guess. This is the wood where my grandfather was in camp when he heard the word come down that the war was going to be over, that the armistice was signed the next morning, and that his war was over, and he had survived. Now, I don't know what rations Rube ate that day, but for us it was lunchtime, and a very nice resort lunch awaited us. So Margaret and I sat down and proceeded to have a beautiful meal in front of a roaring fire, and after a glass of wine, I got up and I gave my letter of introduction in French to the manager, the front desk, the hotel. She read it, she smiled at me, and said in perfect English, "I have goosebumps now," which I thought was so charming. I told her the problem I was having finding the wood. I just couldn't find it on Google Maps. I couldn't find it on Apple Maps, anything. I couldn't even find it on the map they had in the hotel lobby, and it had all the recreational stuff all over the place. No luck. And she said, she would ask the bartender and the waiter, and she did. No luck, they'd never heard of it. And then she said, "Wait, I will call the old man." So evidently there was an in-the-know old-timer at her immediate disposal. I returned to our table. Shortly afterwards, a special drink arrived at our table with the manager's compliments. And then she came over and she reported to me that it would be impossible to visit the wood since it lay beneath, slide, the Lac de Métis. So it was a reservoir about 1 mile away, created 40 years ago to provide drinking water to the city of Metz. So we had a good laugh over that, because the wood was under the lake. So Margaret and I, we drove down to the shoreline, and this is what we saw now. Slide. A bird watching area. So we gazed out, and sure enough, we weren't there like a 1 minute, and the huge flock of geese flew in and settled on the water. And they stayed there for just a little bit. We looked out over the water, and then this, you remember this, they took off over the lake. So that was it. We were there, it was over, I was laughing, Rube was probably laughing. Slide. So, our final visit in the field was to the impressive and moving Meuse-Argonne Cemetery and Memorial, where again my grandfather would have been buried had he not survived these battles in the last few weeks of the war. Over 47 days, 26,000 American soldiers and Marines were killed. 14,246 reside here at the largest American cemetery in Europe. Slide. So this is us at the slide. 22 sets of brothers. You all saw Saving Private Ryan, I hope, from World War II. So this is the reason why that scene occurs in that movie. Because in World War I, this had happened. And it had happened again in World War II, and they didn't want to happen again. So they pulled Private Ryan out of the line. Slide. And there it is. I didn't know it was going to be there, actually. And we were walking up to it, and I looked up, and this is the largest cemetery in Europe, and there's my grandfather's battle emblazoned. There were only 8. And there it is. So, and I can tell you, after walking that ground and seeing the killing fields the German army had designed, and when they went into the wood, they found movie theaters in the Bois de Forêt, movie theaters underground, huge systems for entertainment and supply from the rear. It was an amazing thing. So let's go to the next video, which, for me, encapsulates the relationship between France and the United States.
So you have the chapel in the middle, and then next to it you have the wall, what we call the wall of the missing. So in other words, on these walls you have the names of 954 soldiers whose body was not recovered or not identified.
Okay. Dedicated
to the memory of those who died for their country. Now, when I do a tour, what I do usually is I stop here and I let people read that sentence and think about what it means, because in my opinion, those soldiers didn't die for their country, they died for my country. I'm French, and they were sent for to defend France and the United Kingdom and to fight for freedom. Some of them, I mean, the soldiers who are buried here, they died for a freedom they would never experience. So that's why I like to have people think about it. What would we do if we were called to fight for another country's freedom?
It's interesting. It's a very good question.
Indeed. Indeed. So, after I saw the Bois de Forêt, Margaret and I decided on the spur of the moment, I said, they've got to be here. They have to be here. So we walked up and down the rows. It was a solemn walk. And here the men of the 39th who fell are easy to find among the 14,000 plus graves. Slide. This is the chapel. Slide. Inside. Slide. Unit designations. Slide. 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 Here's the view. All the French flags, all the American flags. Slide. Clinton, Brissette, John, Brown, James, Robinson, William Gerber, Michael Carney, Charles Canavan. These are the men my grandfather may have known or not, but in any case trusted with his life. Their grandchildren, if they had any, never got to hear any stories. This was as far as they would come in their short time in France. Now they are a part of French soil, and a part of France is forever America. Slide. Thank you for hearing the stories tonight. God bless.